Hi.
Hi. Good afternoon, Professor.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Sorry for being late. I got harpooned at
Uh,
lunch.
n- n- no problem, Professor. It's such an honor having you here. And if you're ready, we can start right now and our recording. And I hope you will find our podcast very interesting. And we will also aim to know you as a person and as a professor at sir, an economist professor, of course. So, okay. Let me introduce you to our audience. Today our guest is Professor Jean Imbs, a professor of economics at New York University, Abu Dhabi. He was also a professor at the Paris School of Economics, the London Business School, and many more. And Professor Imbs has done extensive research focusing on international macroeconomics and currently working on the rising importance of global supply chains and their global consequences. And also, I have to mention this. He is also known for his consultant position at in major policy institutions like International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the European Central Bank, and so forth. And as a professor at New York University, Abu Dhabi, Professor Imbs teaches macroeconomics ranging from international finance and economic growth to monetary and fiscal policy. Today, we will be looking at his career as an economist and his research on the last global financial crisis that happened back in 2008. And thank you, Professor. It's such an honor having you here today. Let me introduce myself. I am Shahjahan, or you can call me Sheikh, as my mates does. And next to me are Abror and Aziz, who are also high school seniors and who also want to pursue macroeconomics as their major field. And okay, then let's us give you the microphone. Well, can you just briefly introduce yourself and tell some and also maybe tell something that we forgot to mention.
Well, I'm not sure I can introduce myself better than you have. What I can add, what can I add? I can add that I'm French, that I did my doctoral studies in New York at New York University, actually. And before that, I studied essentially anything but economics. So I came to economics quite late through the doctorate. Before this, I did a business degree in France, and
Oh, I
I've
see.
not at all destined myself for an economics job, or not even a job in academia. So that was a little bit of a self-discovery process in terms of
Hmm,
figuring out that this is actually what I wanted to do. I didn't know I wanted to do that back then.
I see. So, let me ask you this then. How did your interest in economics begin? And could you tell the story behind it? I mean, you was like, you were not interested in economics, but at some part of your life, something like a turning point kind of happened, and you realized that this was like economics was your main thing, and you have a passion for this. Well, how did that happen?
Yeah, it happened serendipitously, which is usually how these things happen. That is, I so I did this business degree.
Uh-huh.
I took a year off once that was completed, essentially because I was not really happy with the type of professional prospects that I could get from that business school back then.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for several reasons. One was that I thought they were very provincial. They were very Franco-French.
Oh,
Um, I also I didn't feel that the type of jobs that I could get after that business school were intellectually challenging in a way that I wanted to populate my life with some essentially intellectual challenges, and then the business school degree didn't. suggest that I would get careers that would satisfy that. So I took a gap year. I essentially traveled, and as I was traveling, I was
Mm-hmm.
very interested in issues of economic development, and in particular, understanding why some countries grow and become rich and others don't.
I see.
What we knew about this and what policy could do about this became
Mm.
a interesting question to me. And so I got into uh, what initially I thought was going to be a master's degree in economics, with a
Oh,
view to working with development agencies, or working perhaps with the World Bank or development banks, institutions, international institutions, sorry,
so,
of one.
so you didn't have any idea of like teaching economics as a professor.
No, so what really happened? No, absolutely, I didn't know. So what had happened is I wanted to work in development, so I did this master's degree, and in the course of doing the master's degree, it became increasingly clear that a PhD would actually give me much more leverage in terms of the jobs.
I see.
I got a temporary an internship at the World Bank, an internship at the IMF during the course of my PhD, and then I I thought both were very, very interesting, and I learned a lot. But one of the key things that I learned during both segment was that it was actually research that I was interested in, and teaching. And
I
so
see.
it is really sort of by trial and error, in my case, that I came to this sort of, narrow down the path towards the thing that really fits me, which is
So,
hopefully.
Like, if not a secret, like who were your main intellectual influences in your college or graduate school and working career?
Uh, so in during my PhD, I think it was my advisor, who was Jordi Galli, along with actually members of my committee, my thesis committee, that I learned to respect immensely.
mm,
So there's Mark Mertler, who's they're all very famous now, but they were very famous then already. There's Mark Gertler, there was David Backus, and Jordi Galli. So they became role models. Firstly, because they gave me advice on what I was doing. So that's sort of an immediate way in which they're, mentors.
I see.
But also in terms of the way in which they were conducting their research, um, the type of topics, the way in which they structured their arguments around the topics that they found interesting, the way you actually build um, an original framework to think about a complicated issue in another way. So I'm not saying I managed to do this, but I certainly took inspiration from the way they were.
I see. So let's switch on your like career as a consultant. Well, from Gregory McQueen's Principle of Economics, I know that there are basically two career paths for economists, like one for science and like policy advising, right? So, but like apparently you have done both. Like you taught and teach at the university and you did research and also you worked as a consultant for in the European Central Bank, right? And like let's first discuss about the your work, your career at as a consultant at the European Bank, and what did it look like working as a consultant there?
So it's interesting how you uh, create this clear dichotomy. So this big difference between the career as a consultant versus career as an academic. In my case, and I
Yeah.
think in the case of most academics, if you're interested in research and if the research you conduct is original and has policy implications or has some following, uh,
Mm-hmm.
you will naturally become an object of interest for a lot of international institutions, that's one thing, central banks, policy institutions, because all of those will be simply interested in your expertise. So, the things that you end up doing in these private or semi-private entities, I mean, the ECB, the World Bank, the IMF are not private, they're very much public,
I see.
is actually just a direct continuation of what you do as an academic. There's no clear distinction between the two. I think, if I had done extensive consulting for, strategic consultancies or, McKinsey's or Bain or even NERA, like economic consultancy, then I would have agreed with you to a larger extent that these two things are quite separate, or banks for that matter, consultancies for
I
banks.
see.
Um, I mean, in a few instances, I did some preliminary work, or I was approached by purely private entities like the ones that I just listed. But it's just not the type of thing that I'm interested in
Oh, I see.
for several reasons, which is the foremost one is that the horizons involved in the type of consultancies contracts that you would have with private entities, the time horizon is short. So you have to produce very, very quickly, and that's not something I'm very good at. Right? My horizon is not my horizon in terms of coming up with a methodology or technique or result or framework is I count it in months. In consultancy, you count that in days. So that's not something I'm good at. I don't know how to do this. So what I did at the ECB or the IMF or the World Bank or the European Commission or in various central banks was very much the continuation of the research I did in universities. And that's, I would say, is a pretty standard thing.
I see. I got it. So, like, Abro has a question for you.
Yeah, Professor Imbs, let me ask you a question. Let's talk about your career in academia. Regarding macroeconomics and international finance, what particularly persuaded you to choose this particular sector as a main subject of your scientific research?
That's a good question. Again, the way in which research develops, I'm saying again because I feel like it's a similar argument to the one I made earlier about serendipity. The thing happened quite serendipitously. So I wrote in my thesis, I wrote a paper about the synchronization of business cycles across countries, and why some countries have cycles that are synchronized and others don't. So there's an empirical piece, and then that led me to start thinking about objects like the exchange rate, for example, or and then that in turn led me to think about inflation, which in turn led me to think about trade, which in turn led me to think about firm level data, and so you just follow that string of you have a first idea, or I'm not sure if it's first.
So a small thing becomes a large over time, and you realize that this particular field is kind of your like research of interest, right? Your interest research.
That's right. You don't. That's correct. I think some people might be able to do this. I most definitely did not. You don't start your career by saying, I will write on this. Enormous contribution in this topic or that. I mean, some very, very, very Nobel Prize winners function like this, but most of us don't. So you develop a field of expertise, you develop a way to think about one issue that leads you into a second issue, which leads you into a third, and so on and so forth. So it is very linear, really.
I see. Like, let's talk about your career as an professor of economics. Well, how do you approach teaching economics students? I mean, what strategies do you use to make complex economic concepts like more accessible? Like I know there are so many examples of like hard, advanced, complex kind of economic concepts like equilibrium and other kind of theories. And how do you kind of approach to make some things? Because you see, we want as seniors and as the one who are willing to apply to those universities, we have to kind of be prepared or to what we should expect from the universities and from like if you are going to NYUAD, we have to know like your kind of a methodology of teaching, right?
So I think there are two approaches in undergrad and graduate schools, for that matter. I think you will have some faculty that will, in some sense, use the material as a selection device. So will not bother very much with intuition and explanations or motivations, but would in the case of economics. So let me backtrack for a second. Economics, as you know, is a social science, but it's a social science that prides itself of being very rigorous and
Yeah.
has a approach that's very systematic and sort of a formal framework in which to think about things that are not formal at all. Grand scheme of things, for example, how much you buy, what you choose to buy, how much you save, the fact that some prices rise faster than others, all these things that we experience on a daily basis, they're not formal. There's no reason why
Yeah.
you should put them as a formal thing. But economics prides itself in being very formal in addressing all of these questions, very formal.
Yeah,
And that's
of course.
great. It's extremely powerful and extremely important to actually have one benchmark to think about the real world in a very structured and organized manner. So that's why, in my view, the field is important, powerful, relevant for policy, relevant for life in general. Okay. But as a result of this, and I go back to my initial point, as a result of this, you can teach economics in two very different ways. One is you focus on this formalism, on this, on the tools that are essentially mathematical tools, quantitative tools at least. You focus on the tools and you let whoever is a student of economics figure out what the underlying intuition is. And you envision your role as a teacher as one that gives you the tools. And then it's up to you to understand what you can and cannot do with these tools, what they mean in terms of everyday life, et cetera, et cetera. The alternative is to, well, kind of do the opposite, and then the opposite starts from the intuition. And once you have an intuition for the framework that economics develops or proposes, once you have an intuition, you can actually formalize that intuition in a way that based in math, essentially, or in quantitative. So for me, I've always been the latter. So I've always privileged intuition over formalism. To me, formalism is should be serving intuition. So
yeah, it's actually kind of really interesting if we kind of consider how you kind of inadvertently, like knowingly prepare your students for the real world of economics. I mean, not formal. I mean, formal world kind of made formal economics may like kind of differ from the actual one. I mean, like how we live and how economics kind of work over time. So yeah, I would agree with you, and I think that is a great way of teaching. And yeah, well,
do anything else because I am not essentially I'm not good enough in math to get an intuition from formalism.
I see.
But the alternative is very, very powerful as well. It really is a a way of seeing the forest behind the tree, right? So the tree is that equation that is completely opaque to you at first. But then once you've actually understood the power of whatever you're playing with, you realize all the applications and the intuitions that might be in that equation. So, I'm not sure any of those two is superior to the other.
Yeah.
But what I'm sure is that for me, I've always started from the intuition. That's my default approach, really.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's kind of a more applicable to the real world, and that would prepare students who can excel in any any terms of economics, right?
Yeah,
So,
I think it might be applicable. It might be more immediately usable for more students.
yeah. And Aziz have question for you.
Yes. I would like to, like, in general, talk about economics and world in general. What do you think? What does the perfect world utopia from an economic perspective look like?
That's an interesting one. Okay, so that's actually an interesting question. As I mentioned before, what economics is trying to do is to provide a benchmark to think about the real world, right? So once you have a good understanding of the workings of that benchmark, you can sort of add bells and whistles that make that benchmark more realistic. And so one way that I find useful to use this reasoning in the real world is to think of the benchmark as something that is frictionless. So a world in which there are no frictions. And what do I mean by frictions? I mean a lot of things, not me. It means a lot of things. What are those frictions? Frictions are things that prevent equilibrium outcomes from happening. Very much clearer. So I could probably use examples. What are the frictions are probably relevant in the real world today? Number one, people cannot move, really. There's massive frictions for prevent people from moving. I think that's probably a first, like the most important one. Well, the same thing is true to an extent of capital. It's very difficult to, for whatever reason, it's very difficult to, for example, if you're sitting in Kazakhstan, it's very difficult to invest in companies that are, on the west coast of the US. That might be incredibly profitable, and you really would like to be invested in those, but you can't. You don't have the information, or it's too far, or whatnot. Factors don't move. Labor, capital, they move, but with great difficulty, lots of frictions. You have frictions for price adjustment. Prices don't adjust. Price mechanisms or market mechanisms don't work very well. I have two young kids. When I was living in France, it was impossible to find daycare. Impossible to find daycare. And I really needed daycare badly. And I was ready to pay a very, very large amount of money for somebody to help me with my kids. Couldn't find anyone. For months. That's a massive friction. The market doesn't work. There's a failure. Pollution, environment, the transition, the ecological transition, climate change, all of these things are massive market failure. They come from the existence of externalities. So, I drive my car, I create a lot of pollution, but it's not priced in. I don't pay for it. I don't pay for it when I buy oil. The price of oil is too low relative to the emissions it creates. So that's, again, a market failure. So what's the utopia? To go back to your question, the utopia is one where, we could think of the world as a deviation from that benchmark, where people could move freely, capital could move freely, price mechanisms work, externalities are internalized. There are market failures as possible, and that, seems to be pretty close to a first best. So this utopia that you mentioned. One caveat that I really want to bring immediately is that makes me sound like I'm a firm believer in free markets, and I don't think anybody should interfere with markets, but that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is market outcomes are first best, and then they can be corrected through redistributive policies. And those redistributive policies are not necessarily creating distortions or frictions or market failures. They're two different. You can certainly redistribute. Because some whatever, there are people that are old, there are people that are sick, there are people that don't have a job. Even in a fully unfettered and fully free market economy, you can still have these qualities. And so redistribution is potentially necessary and useful from a welfare standpoint. What matters is that this redistribution creates as few frictions and as few market failures as possible.
So what do you think, what comes first in your opinion, economics or politics? I mean, in terms of what has an impact on the other?
Well, do you really want to have a first one though? Because I'm not sure there's a first one. I can think of instances where politics has first order effects on economic outcomes. And right now, where I'm standing now in the Middle East is a very good example of this. Politics is having massive economic consequences.
Yes.
Whether it is because of the price of oil or because of the refugee situation in the whole of the Levant, in Lebanon and Israel and Jordan and Syria and so on and so forth. These are massive economic issues, and they come purely from politics. On the other hand,
so it's something like a cycle that it's kind of related within themselves, right? I mean, one affects the other, and it's kind of really hard to say that politics is more impactful than the economics or something like this, right?
I think if you want to say this at some level of generality, you're doomed for failure. There's no way you can make a general point about which one drives the other, because the causality going the other way is at least as prevalent. You can think of the state of the economy and how much that affects election outcomes, or the emergence of autocracies, or actually the emergence of democracies, all of which can be, or historically has proved to be, extremely determined by economics. So to give you just one example, again, I'm French, and so there's abundant evidence that the French Revolution came from a small period of not very dry weather, and so not quite a famine, but several years of really not fun times, economically speaking, and boom, that created a revolution. So economics, there's France, there's the US right now with the election, there's India, the election a little earlier in the year, et cetera, et cetera. So it goes both ways. And I don't think make any generals about which way it goes. Which way it goes.
Okay. And Professor, well, there is a podcast of Lex Friedman I watched, and where he discussed problems with simplifying the world down to an model with I think Michael Saylor, I suppose. Well, it's interesting for me to hear your perspective on the matter. Well, what's your point of view? I mean, what is the fundamental problem with the way economists reduce the world down to a model? I think you kind of already given the answer to question partly, but I think it would be better if you can elaborate on that further.
Yeah. So I would say the problem is not with economists, by the way, because no self-respecting economist, yours truly included, would just say that the model is to be used to understand reality. No self-respecting economist would tell you, I'm going to be able to forecast when the recession is going to hit.
Yeah.
So, as I think it's Robert Lucas who said that, who was a Nobel Prize winner from University of Chicago. What he said was, we already have a very complicated model, the real world. The problem with the real world is that we don't understand the real world. We don't,
Oh,
we don't understand channels of causality. We don't know what causes what. We don't know if this happens because of that or because of this. We can't know. No one can know it. We speculate, we conjecture, but there's no way in which you can prove a chain of causality.
mhm.
Yeah.
Given one specific interest. When you have a model, you simplify, obviously, no question about it. It's a naive, sometimes even offensive simplification of reality.
Mm.
But again, no self-respecting economist would not acknowledge that. We all acknowledge their simplifications, but
Mhm.
their simplifications with a purpose. And the purpose is typically causality. It is,
Mhm.
let me see if I can strip down reality from a few ingredients that I speculate are not key to what I'm after. For
I see.
example, suppose I want to explain um, the price of oil.
Yeah.
Example. So if I want to explain the price of oil, there's going to be plenty of things that are relevant, but also plenty of things that are not relevant. And the ones that are not relevant, I can at least try and strip them from my simplified model. I strip them off. They're not there, but I focus on the things that I believe are interesting. And then I churn my model, I simulate it, and I ask my model, can you replicate what we see in the data? And if you
Yeah.
can, that's a pretty good sign that the things you kept in your model are pretty important when it comes to explaining the price of oil, if that's what you want to explain. So
I see.
that's the intellectual approach, right? It's hypothetical deductive. You actually formulate hypotheses which you build into your model, and then you ask your model, what does that predict? And then you
Mhm.
confront
Mhm.
these predictions with reality. But no one in that process, no one claims or should claim, but no one should claim that
Yeah, of course, that's correct.
it's not the point.
Yeah, sure. Then, okay, let's switch on your research then. I mean, like the first global recession in decades. It was the name, right? Well, it was written back in 2010, and right after the end of the turmoil, during like that happened during the 2008 and had its effects on like economic effects in 2009, and like it was unprecedented given its level. Like it spread it full, like around the world, and we thought that you wrote it like as a kind of a post effect of the turmoil. And in reading your paper, I was amazed like by how you extensively analyzed the whole situation and try to make consequent comparisons with that of the like previous shocks, the like economic shocks that happened in the last century. And well, my first question would be like, do you believe that future global recessions will follow the similar patterns, like, or do you foresee like new kinds of crisis like emerging from factors like happening like technological disruptions or geopolitical tensions, or should we say that they are happening now, like given the fact that like the rise of AI and you can say the current tensions between Israel and the like the in the Middle East, let's see.
Yeah, so I wrote this, as you said, just after the global financial crisis. And then the idea back then, it was 10, 15 years ago, was to make the point that the extent of the synchronization cross country around the world, the response to well, the experience that many countries had of these crises was very, very similar. So in other words, it was the most, if you want, synchronized uh, crisis in the history, at least of the 20th century, and well,
Yeah.
20th, 21st, and part of 19th century. We've had very, very few such episodes. And when I wrote this paper, I compared 2008 with 1929, which then too was pretty global.
Yes.
But since then, COVID was 10 times more global than the global financial crisis because it affected everyone,
Yeah,
like
of course.
everyone, whereas the global financial crisis did not affect everyone. So for COVID,
So
everybody went red. So it's
it
even
was
more,
like not an like indirect kind of a effect like that affected the global economy and prevent the global economy from rising like in during the COVID 19 times, right?
so I mean, what happened to, we don't want to rewrite history, but what happened is the pandemic forced, you know, imposed forced holidays on most of the world because everybody had to stay home.
Yeah.
So demand collapsed. You cannot go shopping when you're home. The only thing you can perhaps do, if you're lucky enough to have a delivery guy, is to order things on Amazon.
Yeah.
So that's I think the reason why was global is not very deep. It's just is a truly global shock. But now you're asking whether there's a trend. So one of your questions is whether are things becoming increasingly global? That's a really, really deep question. It's a difficult question to answer, right? So typically, the way in which I think you should think about recessions is
Yeah,
that
of course.
they come at the end of a period during which fragility is rising. What kind of, it could be a lot of things. It could be rising inflation. It could be the unemployment is slowly rising. It could be
Climate change.
sorry, say that again.
Climate change also, maybe.
Yeah, so climate change is not completely clearly a source of fragility from an economic standpoint. At least we have not reached that level yet. It's possible.
Hmm.
We had 2001 was a recession, and that was a recession driven by a stock market crash. That the correction,
Yeah.
stock prices went really quote
Yeah.
unquote
Okay.
benefit of hindsight. 1974 was an oil price shock. 19
Then
price shock.
1991,
1991.
the fall of USSR and the other countries, the emergence of other countries.
So with the benefit of hindsight, when you look at past recession, you can always point to a triggering factor that sort of pushed you over the edge. Right?
Hmm.
So that tells us two things about recessions. The first thing it tells us is that they're sort of bubbling under, they're building up in the background without, without anything sudden. So as I said, the fragility increases. Countries, their debts, they become increasingly fragile, when the interest rate changes, for example, or countries spend too much, or stock prices rise too fast, things like this. And then, boom, then there's a sudden event. This is the one benefit of hindsight. And that sudden event basically tips you into recession. And those are the events. Okay, so it's a combination of two things. One, buildup of imbalances of fragility, and two, something that tips you over. So where are we? So two questions. The first question is that you asked is that becoming more global?
Yeah.
And the second question is where are we now, I guess. So is it becoming more global? I think to an extent the answer to that is yes, and that is because of the global supply chain, which is the thing that I work on right now. That in the sense that different countries, different industries, different regions of the world are becoming increasingly interconnected. We saw that, for example, during the Fukushima
Yeah,
earthquake
eh,
had consequences. Things don't happen in isolation anymore. You can have one region of one country that is experiencing a very bad negative shock without that having some international consequences, perhaps even global consequences. So I think
Hmm.
a cautious answer to your question of whether it becomes more global is probably. Although, we have not seen, except for COVID, an obvious increase in the globalism. Sure, to say
Ah,
that. The global dimension of recessions has not observably increased in the past decade. So it might be happening, but it's not so obvious in the data yet.
I see. And our friend Aziz has a question for you.
Okay.
Yes, yes. So, like, how did the emergence of CIS in the early 1990s affect the global economy? And, like, what implications does this have for how we view economic integration today? What do you think about this, Professor?
That's a hard question. So one short answer is that, with all due respect, these economies are relatively small on a global scale. Uh,
Mhm.
so obviously if you talk about the Baltic countries, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia,
Mhm.
uh, they're very, very small. Very, very small.
Mhm.
Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia. Don't get me wrong, they're big countries. They're very important. They're very important geopolitically. They're very important in some markets. Kazakhstan is
Of
very
course.
on the energy,
Yes.
right? But in terms of their sheer size, we're not talking about China.
Hmm.
Even for
Yeah,
some, can be relatively small. So that's not to say that that didn't have any consequences, but I think most of the consequences are geopolitical and local.
Mhm.
hmm
So local because most of the ex-CIS countries, the sort of satellite countries of the ex-Soviet Union, still to this day have very, very tight um, trade linkages, in particular, with Russia.
Yeah,
Yes, you're right.
For example, in terms of the supply of energy. So I mentioned the Baltic countries earlier. They're highly, highly dependent on Russia's oil and gas. And that's probably definitely it's definitely true as well of Eastern European countries, and not to mention Belarus and Poland.
of course. It's also interesting, I mean, you wrote a research paper on the sanctions that was put on Russia, right? I also had the pleasure of reading it, and it was really kind of well written and well analyzed. I mean, have you kind of analyzed the impact, like the economic impact of sanctions on the ex-satellites of the Russia, Litva, Latvia, Estonia? The impact was like much higher than the other Western countries like Germany or UK or France. It was like I think fourfolds, right? I mean, it's really it also had a kind of an impact on our country. So we are also kind of was a part of the USSR, and it's really interesting that those sanctions also had an impact on our economy, and there was some like the inflation rates that our country was not able to kind of well, what can I say? Yeah, the inflation kind of rose when Russia invaded Ukraine, like back in 2008. Yeah, and what do you think that well, would this have also like long-term effects on these CIS countries? I mean, our country or the other like 15 countries, even if the war kind of stops.
Oh no, I think this is what I had in mind when I mentioned geopolitics, right? So the geopolitics and actually geography, probably geography more than geopolitics, uh, matters for matters for trade, matters for trade relations between countries. So Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, all of these countries are heavily integrated with Russia. And incredibly persistent. The main reason why it's so persistent is, well, there's infrastructure. So if you trade energy, you certainly need a lot of infrastructure.
Sure.
And another one is discovery. So you know the markets. And okay, so it used to be one single country, Soviet Union. It's 2 or 3 or 15 or 16 countries. But the market access, the specific knowledge, the local information continue to be relevant. And it continues to be difficult to explore alternatives. And, you're sitting in Uzbekistan and starting to trade with China is not that straightforward because the language is different. You don't have any contacts locally. You don't have any infrastructure. It's not clear there's a road, et cetera, et cetera.
Of course.
So there's a lot of persistence. Now, you're saying what are the consequences for Central Asian countries
Yes.
of the invasion of Ukraine or the end of the war in Ukraine, potentially? I think they're first order. I mean, it has to be. So there's structure my thoughts a little bit. There are two potential effects, right? One is the fact that there's more uncertainty, there's more risk, there's more hesitation to start any new business in as much as in Russia. Because there's this war and the threat of this war, you don't know what's going to fall on you, literally. And so, you might want to be more prudent than you would be otherwise. So you don't start your business now. You don't buy this new car now. You don't take this holiday now, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to have, simply through an effect of uncertainty, you just don't do it. There's a second effect, which works the other way, which is, the war between Russia and Ukraine, in some perverse way, is affecting surrounding countries because they become a point of diversion. So in particular, trade diversion can happen. So Russia can start exporting, or maybe Uzbekistan can start exporting because Ukraine doesn't do it anymore, or because Russia doesn't do it anymore, right? So there's markets that you can corner because the incumbents basically left, because the incumbent is now at war. And so it is like wars, it is both creating uncertainty, but also emerging opportunities. The structure of trade changes because of war.
I see.
Wars are pretty much the only thing that can affect trade. It's very difficult to affect trade through policy, for example. Tariffs matter to an extent, but wars matter much, much, much more than trade policy.
I see. Getting back to your research paper, 2008 crisis, during that crisis, you were working as a consultant at the European Central Bank, right? And I'm sure that this crisis also had a negative influence on the European Union, and you were there when they were discussing and making decisions to alleviate problems that problems arising from the effects of the crisis, right? I mean, that it affected you in some ways, and you have to alleviate it. And can you tell us, particularly about that experience and what you did and how it felt, and also what kind of advices, as a consultant, you were able to give to make a kind of a alleviation?
So look, I was definitely not at the level at which I could make recommendations regarding what policies the ECB should implement to get out of the global financial crisis. And then, by the way, there was also a debt crisis in Europe, which by some measures was more serious than the 2008 subprime crisis, as you can call it. I would say that so during the subprime crisis itself, there was an underassessment on the part of most policy institutions.
Mhm.
Otherwise, underassessment about the severity of what that was going to be globally. And that's one of the reasons I wrote this paper, because the expectation was, there's one sector in the US, not that big a sector for that matter, which is the real estate sector. So one class of assets, housing, that's its
Mhm.
price drop. I mean, the price of housing did drop in the US by quite a bit. It was a big shock. But if you're standing in Frankfurt and you're wondering, how much do I care about this? The answer back then actually was practically not much. You know, I'm a central bank. What I care about is price stability, and then perhaps to an extent economic activity. And that doesn't seem to be affecting either to a first order before the fact, the face of it. So
Mhm.
listen, it is not alone in this case, by the way. I certainly don't want to single out anyone for having missed the big picture. I think everybody missed the big picture.
Of course.
But ECB did not think it was going to be a big deal.
Um,
And it is only a couple of years after Lehman Brothers collapsed that it became clear that this was a full-blown global financial crisis that worked its way through the banking system.
mhm.
You know, we kind of had forgotten about banks and how crucial banks are for a number of things. One is financing credit, that is financing investment, that is financing, you know, an increase in the capacity of firms, growth, to make it short. Banks are central to that. And we also forgot about banks in the sense that we forgot how instrumental they were in channeling monetary policy. So when the central
Mhm.
change in their interest rate, the effect that this has on the economy works itself through banks.
Yeah, of course.
The banking system is not doing well, as was the case back then. That stunts monetary policy.
Uh,
Both of these things were I think, undervalued massively by everyone. It's not an exception.
So
I
I
see.
had a question regarding the Basel III reform that was implemented right after the 2008 subprime crisis. So do you believe that this reform have sufficiently addressed the risks for future downturns, or it have they simply delayed the next crisis?
That's virtually impossible to answer with precision. What I would say is that all tests, simulations that central banks, again, you know, most of those simulations are performed by central banks. Those simulations seem to suggest that banks have become much more resilient in the sense that a crash in a specific class of assets, or perhaps even in broad classes of assets, is in those simulation is shown to be less consequential for the health of banks. Okay? So you know, first of all, what does that matter? I mean, one of the things that happened a couple of years after Lehman Brothers, I alluded to it a minute ago, is this debt crisis in Europe. And it was exactly the same idea. It's just that lots of European banks were holding in their portfolio, in their assets, in their balance sheets, they were holding sovereign debt, Irish debt, Spanish debt, Italian debt, Greek debt.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, these debts just collapsed. Why? Well, because the governments that issued these debts were, well, their debt was too high. So, you know, holding Greek debt when it's not completely clear whether and how Greece is going to pay back this debt, it's becoming an increasingly poor decision. The value of the Greek debt that you have in your balance sheet is falling. And so the same thing happened in some sense at Lehman Brothers, except that Lehman Brothers, the problem was that you were holding mortgage-backed securities whose value collapsed. Well, 3 or 4 years later in Europe, you were holding Greek debt whose value collapsed. It's the same
Yes.
as. And then if you're a bank, that's a problem because your balance sheet becomes problematic. You don't have assets to back up your liabilities. And the problem is that banks have a vast majority of short-run liabilities, which are you and I, our and your deposits. We can go to the bank, withdraw all our deposits now, next 5 minutes. And the bank has to have assets to honor these liabilities. So they are leveraged business.
Yeah.
Currently,
Yes. Professor Imbs, I really wanted to hear your perspective, like on this matter. Like, do you think that countries should focus more on insulating themselves from global economic synchronization, or just adapt to that global interconnectedness if we were to expect the next global shock? What do you think about that?
So, just to finish on Basel III, these two are related, but on Basel III, I think Basel III was a step in the right direction because it limited the extent to which banks could leverage like that, and limited the extent to which basically go into insolvency and bankruptcy in the case of a large shock. Mind you, what the banks did in response to that Basel III is they started creating entities outside of their balance sheets, so-called shadow banks that allowed them to continue to leverage themselves. Okay, so it's not clear that that problem has gone away from this standpoint, like off-balance sheet operations that banks conduct. In terms of insulating yourself from global synchronization or global shocks, it's a matter of judgment. There's a trade-off here, right? It doesn't come for free. Insulating yourself, not free. It means that, I don't know even where to start, right? It means that, so I live in the UAE right now. So I take this extreme example, in the UAE, insulating yourself from global trade is a very bad idea.
Yeah.
Because everybody who lives here, there's nothing to eat, quite literally. Because it is important. I exaggerate, not everything is important, but a lot of things are important. And so
It
trade
would
is
be the next. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Like it would be the next, like North Korea or kind of a Turkmenistan, if you think of like that. I mean, we like that. Yeah, the global trade is necessary to kind of feed the people, like within the country, and even if like we have enough to kind of, we have enough to live at subsistence level, right?
so imports are, we sort of raised in the belief that imports are bad and we should limit imports. What's good is exports. The good thing about trade is imports, because that's what you want to eat that's not produced at home.
Yes,
And
yes.
exports serve to pay these imports. Okay, so that's the role of exports. So, but I'm answering your question in a very caricatural manner. Obviously, if we completely close the border, that's a bit absurd for a lot of countries, right?
Yeah.
But I think the more subtle answer to your question is that, is there a way of doing this carefully, sort of avoid these types of imports for this type of sector coming from that specific country or that specific country sector? I think the answer to that is much, much, much harder to give, right? Because it actually does depend on the feature of that global supply chain. So for all we know, the global supply chain, the ways in which goods are going back and forth over borders to get to their final state, iPhone, for example. For all we know, these back and forth movements form a network that has very central hubs, that has some points in it that are actually neural, that they're very, very, very central. So now, another way of answering your question is to say, well, let's just look at this carefully and see how much worse off Uzbekistan citizens would be if it chose not to import from the Chinese steel industry, because that seems to be very risky globally.
Yeah.
So the trade-off would be, on the one hand, the stuff that you would have to buy somewhere else would be more expensive, but on the other hand, you subject it to less risk. Now, that question is a question that can only be answered in a model. That is, in a model where you can run counterfactuals, where you can say, what would happen if Uzbekistan didn't import from China steel anymore? And that's why we have models to run counterfactuals. So that's actually things I'm doing. It's a good question. A difficult question.
And Abraham has a question for you about like the digital currencies, I think.
Yeah, what do you think of the future of AI in terms of international trade, would it help prevent us from the next global crisis by making a fully analyzed like decision making or not?
No, I don't think crises, shocks happen because of mistakes that would not be made if the decision-making process was in the hand of an AI. I don't believe that. So there's two levels of that question. One is plausibility and one is feasibility. So what I mean by that is, for example, if you look at the 2001 stock crash, the IT bubble crash in 2001, I can reinterpret your question as saying, would we have had such a crash had trading being done exclusively by AI?
Mm.
Firstly, I'm not sure we would have avoided it. I'm not sure. I'm not exactly sure what algorithms these hypothetical AI would follow. And secondly, I'm not sure it's a good idea to have AI trade in asset prices. AI is an incredibly powerful tool to increase our productivity.
Yes,
But,
yes.
but it's not an autonomous entity that can make decisions. Another shock that comes, there's the Kipur War in 1974, there's the Iranian Revolution in 1979. I'd be hard-pressed to make a statement about whether these events would have been avoided had AI been more prevalent. Not completely clear to me.
I see.
These shocks that push us over the tipping point into a recession, I'm not sure they would be avoidable even with a very advanced form of AI.
I see. Okay, and like this will be the last question, I think, of the research part. And what do you think, like, with the rise of digital currencies like Bitcoin and other currencies and decentralized finance, as you have already mentioned, how do you foresee these like new financial technologies like affecting global business cycle synchronization in particular, and the like transmission of the future crisis?
Right. So okay. So I would try and separate things out a little bit more systematically here in terms of answering your question. You're right that on the one hand we have technologies, blockchain technology in particular, that has made it possible to have something akin to private money. Something akin to. It's not quite the same, but it's akin to it. And Bitcoin is one prominent example of that.
Of course. given the
Um,
fact it's like worth right now.
the fact that it's what you say?
It's worth and like how it can that affects overall the some parts like some, I mean how it fluctuates over time. It's worth. I mean, it's kind of right now in I don't exactly know how much is it it is now, but it's kind of like around it's like around $60,000 one Bitcoin, I suppose, and its fluctuation kind of has like a great effect on some people's living too.
So I think what you say is interesting because what you're saying is that it's an asset price. It's an
Yeah,
asset on par with gold or diamonds or oil or house or stock price. It's an asset. Money, cash, dollars, they're also assets. So in
yeah.
that sense, the fact that it's an asset doesn't mean it's not money. But there's I I'm not entirely sure blockchain
Mm,
is that new, let's say Bitcoin or digital currencies are that new from an historical standpoint. So I'll give you two references, 2 points of references. One is in most countries, European countries and the US as well, there was a pretty long period of time prior to the emergence of a central bank. So
mhm,
The Federal Reserve in the US was created first few years of the 20th century. The US lived for almost 140 years without a central bank.
Mm.
Okay, so
yeah.
140
Yes,
years,
yes.
there were tons of private monies,
Mm,
tons. There were lots
Mm.
of dollars. Different banks, different local banks issued different types of dollars. Yeah, so we've had that before. We've had private issuers of currency.
mhm,
And we've had that in Italy, in the Renaissance area. We've had that during Napoleonic Wars. We've had tons of that. The thing is, it doesn't work well at all. What it does is that it creates a very fertile ground to have repeated banking crisis accompanied with currency crisis. So these private currencies had a tendency to repeatedly crash, disappear, crash and burn, basically. The, the,
mhm,
the, the currency, the private currency issued by the Bank of Kansas, just overnight goes to zero. I don't know, because
mhm.
somebody is robbing the bank, literally. And so there's nothing to back up that currency. Poof, the currency goes to zero. Financial crisis. We're talking about serious things. That all those people that were holding their savings in using that currency, it's wiped out. Boom, zero, nothing. And it's not mundane. It's actually
Well, well,
did by a banker. It was created by J.P. Morgan. Are you still there?
yeah, well, I think you kind of lagged a bit, so we couldn't catch up you.
Okay, let me do something
Okay, no problem.
real quick. All right, just change
Yeah,
the
it's okay
sheet.
now.
Right. So part of the reason why the Fed was created was to alleviate these problems, to address these problems. And it's interesting to remember that the Fed was created by a banker, was created
Mm,
by J.P. Morgan and others, but he was one of them. Okay, so the creation of the Fed, the creation of the US dollar, the fact that there's a central bank that issues the legal tender of the US, that was created so as to stop the
mhm,
random emergence and actually disappearance of private money, private
mm.
currencies.
Let's see.
So what that means is today, the emergence of Bitcoin, et cetera, is or all sorts of means of payments that bypass the central bank, of which there's quite a few because of the blockchain technology, um, is a cause for worry, is a cause of worry for a lot of central banks.
Yeah,
Very
sure.
worrisome. It's a recipe for financial crisis everywhere, and a lot of them, which is it should be avoided at all costs.
Of
Um,
course.
so central bank digital currencies are the response to this. They're trying to create their own version of Bitcoin, etc., because uh, they want to address, offer the type of services that digital currencies, existing digital currencies offer, but within the remit of the central bank, so that you preserve financial stability. And I think they're winning, by the way. I think they're winning. I think no one is taking Bitcoin seriously in terms of an actual money. It's not a currency.
Yeah.
Bitcoin is the speculative asset. It's not a currency, and it's not going to change the view of currencies. It's used for very, very few transactions, and also very, very specific transactions. So, you're asking me whether that the emergence of CBDC, central bank digital currencies, were going to change the characteristics of policy or the business cycle.
Yeah.
Not. The only thing it could change, is the emergence of more financial crisis more often. So it would change things for the worse, in my view.
Of course. Well, thank you, Professor. It was like really nice talk about your research paper and your ideas on such kind of crisis. And now we kind of want to give you kind of a short questions just to get to know you like apart from academia. I mean, you kind of also live a life of a human. So, and we also have some things we want to kind of share with others, like apart from like economics or the economics things. So, well, let me ask you this kind of a question. Well, if it's not a secret, well, you worked at several universities, right? Like the London Business School and others, but now you're at New York University, Abu Dhabi campus. And what is special about it that makes it different from other universities?
Oh, it's a very, very interesting place, and it's a very um, interesting project. It's a very young university. It's a little bit more than 10 years old. I,
Yeah.
I used to come here for a very short period of time. So in 2011, 12, 13, 14, I would come for like a month and a half or 2 months, teach one class, and then go back to wherever I was coming from.
Mm.
And then at some point, I stopped literally myself and looked at what the university was becoming. And it has been, or it was becoming, and it has since been becoming a very, 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 very impressive institution.
Hmm.
I can try and explain that to you why. Okay, so it's got lots of resources.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Uh,
you're right.
but what's really interesting is that it's got lots of resources, and it's using them in a very
Effective.
in a very smart way. That is, it is using these resources to actually sponsor research and students. So to give you an example of each, in every single class I teach here, I think with almost no exception, the class all the 25 students, something like this. In every single class, there's one or two students who are literally the first of their family to ever set foot in a university. And the reason why that is because there are scholarship programs that
Yeah.
are for their family. And I've taught, as you said, in many universities. I've never seen that, ever. And it is life-changing for these
Yeah, of
students,
course.
even for me. I mean, it makes teaching very gratifying. So
Yeah,
that resources for students. And there's a lot of resources for research as well. And it's done very carefully with the proper governance and the proper allocation of resources. So I like all of these things. The university is quite impressive. I never thought, as a matter of fact, I never thought I would stay here so long. I've been here 5 years,
Yeah.
and I'm very content with my job here, which I find interesting both for teaching and research purposes. And then life is very easy in the UAE. Is very UAE is remember we were talking about an environment is as frictionless. I use that terminology, as frictionless as possible.
Like in
The
terms of everything, NYU Abu Dhabi is the best. Like,
I'm not sure if it's the best, but it is very, very good. It has a lot to say for itself. It is well functioning, it's got really nice amount of resources and it's using it well. What I mean to say is that there are lots of places in the world that have lots of money.
Yeah.
Venezuela is one of them. Nigeria is one of them. Angola is one of them. All these places have a lot of money, but they don't do very impressive things with that money.
Yeah.
Whereas here, it is quite impressive.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
that's really kind of interesting. Like, I mean, when we look at your CV, the longest period you had, like you worked was like 5 years, and you are in your 6 years, like at New York University Abu Dhabi, and we thought that it would had something that kind of captivated your attention, and for that reason you are now, and you are kind of making the best of your life.
Yeah. You're right. You're entirely right. I'm very, very aware of this, that typically after 4 or 5 years in a university or in a place in general, I get tired with some things. I'm tired enough that I really want to leave. And that's not the case here. It's interesting.
like Professor Imbs, yeah, like you were in three and more universities where you like taught students. Would you advise NYU Abu Dhabi as a final destination for students? Like a
Final destination means that I will die here. So I'm not, that's
no,
hopefully.
I don't mean final, like a good place and better place than other universities.
There's something special to this university for the reasons I mentioned earlier, which is the fact that it is truly amazingly diverse, like truly amazingly diverse. Oftentimes, you hear that the London School of Economics is very diverse, or some American universities are very diverse, which remains
Yeah, in reality, they are not.
terms. Yeah. But this, so it's incredibly diverse, and um, it takes a little bit of guts, some uh, taste for some form of adventure. You have to be a little bit adventurous to come here because it's a little bit off the beaten track. Going to Princeton or going to Harvard or going to the LSE goes without saying, of course. But here it's a little bit off the beaten track. So it is a little bit of a gutsy move. And what I mean to say is that as a result, the people who are here are interesting.
Yeah.
In that dimension, at least in that dimension, they're interesting in the sense that they are interested in the region or in the project or in something that's pretty much work in progress. All of which I kind of relate with. I really appreciate the sort of Wild West feel that you have here, which is things are not finished.
Yeah.
They're still being made. And I kind of like that.
I see. And like, I had a question, like, who would you be if you were not an economist? I mean, when I kind of saw your personal website, I was shocked. Like you had a knack for photographing and like traveling. I
Hmm.
mean, I kind of saw that you kind of went to Kilimanjaro and you kind of, uh, I think also had kind of an interest in philosophy, like from your the quote "Cogita ergo sum" and others. And yeah, the pictures you had also were like very impressive. So I kind of this question arose like while I was kind of seeing, and I thought I was like so interested to give you this particular question of, like in this podcast.
Well, thank you for the appreciation. Now, you don't know what you don't know is how many hundreds of pictures I've taken of
Uh,
the five that I have on my website that are carefully selected. But seriously, I don't know. I don't know. That's the counter. That's very difficult counterfactual, right? Because I suppose if I go back to the first few things I said, this serendipity, right? The serendipity of
yeah.
things moving from one point to the next, and so pretty much there's at any of these junctures there's an alternative path, and so you're asking me for a counterfactual. I don't know which node to go back to and take another route at that node rather than the one next or the one before would give completely different outcomes. I did a business school degree in France. I suppose that the natural trajectory would have been to work in France in some consulting company or
Mm.
the big three. I think there are three now, the big three accounting firms, something, that would have been sort of a natural trajectory. Yeah, possibly. I'm much happier who I am now. I can tell you that. That's for
I
sure.
see.
So let's
And a
imagine
professor.
that you have a chance to speak to anyone from the history. Who would that person be, and what would you talk about with him or her? Let it be from a movies, from kind of history, or else.
That's a really hard question. That's a really, really hard question. Um, wow. I suppose I would be interested in talking with somebody who made difficult policy choices.
Hmm.
What
Mhm.
are like a pretty difficult policy choice to make, which can range from Mario Draghi from the European Central Bank, who did a couple of really gutsy things, but it could also include, Winston Churchill,
All right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
who also made incredibly difficult choices. And
Of course.
I would want to understand what's the decision process that led to the decision they made, whether there was one or whether it was a complete gamble, uh,
Mhm.
how much informed these decisions were. Was it gutsy? Was it intuitive?
Mhm.
Or really formalized and thought out very carefully? I think that's the type of thing that would be interested in how people that make really, really hard decisions, how they come up with those decisions they make.
Yeah, very interesting.
Good question.
And Aziz has a
Yes.
question for you.
Like as a person, everybody contemplates and make and like sometimes they give question to themselves. So what is one special question you found interesting but still could not find the answer? One special one, like
All right, so sorry, in what world, so in what framework, what questions about what?
like like
In
I would
general, let's say,
yes.
like not an academia, that may be like your in your life.
You're asking really, really difficult questions. it was easier for me when you were asking an economics question.
I mean, I also kind of contemplate like sometimes like what's the meaning of life? I mean, yeah, I kind of find answer, but it turns out like nonsense at the end. So yeah, we also have that questions that we couldn't ask, and yeah, and still couldn't find. Maybe we'll find, but nobody knows.
you know, okay, so I'll try that. Okay, so I'll try that, but I'm not sure if it'll be answering the type of query you have. But so oftentimes we define ourselves as individuals negatively. So we define ourselves in terms of what we are not, or what we don't want to be, or what we don't like. Yeah. So
Yeah,
one way in which actually I described that earlier. And one way in which my career happened was like by narrowing down things. So no, this I don't like, this I don't like, this I don't like, and then I get to whatever, the World Bank or an academic career. So well, I prefer the academic career, so I don't like the World Bank. So we define our preferences very often negatively.
Hmm.
And that's a
yeah,
pity, because you would like, at least in theory, in principle, in an ideal world, to sort of define it positively. This is what I like. This is what I want to do. And, and I've always liked this, and I've always been attracted to this, and et cetera, et cetera. Not me. Like the life I've had was very much, well, let's eliminate this, let's eliminate that, let's eliminate. And so the question is, okay, what would have been the positive sort of
Thing here.
the mirror image of what happened, but in a positive way as opposed to a negative way. That is, I don't have.
I see. That's like kind of contemplating and really hard to answer, of course. I mean, yeah.
That hard to answer questions. So there you go.
And I think the question, like I will give you kind of be the last question of our podcast. And yeah, I want to conclude by saying this, like, can you advise like young people like us, like in high school and maybe college, like maybe they are interested into economics, or maybe they have other career ideas. What advice, one advice would you give them about their life and how they want to live in, and or some kind of about a career that they can have and be proud of? It can be like related to their life or career, like the one that you want to give the most.
Hmm. Um, okay, so I would say, so two things. First, it's never too late to change your mind. And that's an important one. It's never too late to change your mind. It's the very few instances in which the costs of going an alternative direction is really unbearable. That's I think really exception rather than the rule. And then the second one, I was just saying a minute ago that you define yourself. I mean, I sort of define myself negatively in some sense. I did define myself negatively by exploring the things that I did not like, focus on the ones that I did like. But at least I define myself on the basis of myself. So one thing that I find to be very inefficient is one way of characterizing it, but also misguided and probably a waste of time, is to define yourself in terms of your peers or your surroundings or your friends or your judges or whoever is looking at you. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, and more importantly, it should not matter. The thing that matters is to define yourself in terms of what you learn about yourself, what you learn that you don't like, as I just mentioned about myself, but also in terms of the things that you do like. And so if you put these two things together, you can change at any time, really.
Yeah.
Very
Totally agree.
often in the students that I've met here and elsewhere, graduate or undergraduate, make decisions about their own future, actually their own education, their own future, on the basis of what people around them are doing. And that's one. And two, on the basis of trying to keep as many doors open as possible so that they don't have to choose. And these two things, to me, speak volumes about the lack of dialogue between them and themselves. The only person that has anything to say about what you want and don't want to do is you.
Yeah.
That's like really contemplating and kind of encouraging advice, and we can use it as a quote, like motivational quote, actually. And thank you, Professor. Like it was like our honor and privilege having you here. I mean, we had a great time of knowing you as both as a person, as an economics professor, and if I would given a chance, I would mm, I would do that again, and kind of I would also have some kind of ideas of conducting the next podcast with you, like the series of podcasts, like when I hopefully go to NYU Abu Dhabi, like when I kind of want to when I kind of meet you, like I think at least one of us will have a time to have kind of speak with you in person, and I hopefully be like it will be as impressive as this episode. And I think that was like one of the best hours, a couple of hours that I had in my life. It was really insightful, given the fact of your how you can gave your insights on the macroeconomics and international finance, and about your own perspectives of the future. And I would say thank you, just thank you. And it's really was really I mean, insightful, and we kind of at some points of this episode had thought about economics and in depth, and also questioned our life, and the advices you gave also will be, I think, useful for the audience who will be watching. And yeah.
Hope so. Well, thanks very much. Thank you. That was great fun. Thank you for reaching out.
And if you have any feedbacks or questions for us, we are open. You can feel free to just say, or we can contact you again. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor. It was very insightful to talk to you today.
We're great
Thank
to
you.
talk to you.
Thank you. Bye.
And
We'll meet
from
in
your
person.
CV, we had seen that you kind of wrote some of your papers